Well, thank you very much. It's been a very interesting debate. It's very nice to be back at the Oxford Union. Apologies for being poorly dressed. I did have black tie when I was at Oxford, but it's more than 12 years ago now, and I tried on my black tie earlier, and it looks less like a dinner suit than a wetsuit. But notwithstanding my dress, I would like to tackle some of the things that have not been tackled, and answer some of the speeches that have already come from both sides, and to address what I think is an issue we have to take seriously, because it's about our future as a country and a society, and it's, in my opinion, not going to be easy, and it's going to require quite a lot of fairly clear, tough
Douglas Murray and Maya Goodfellow recently engaged in a heated debate about immigration and its effects on British society. The conversation highlighted deep divides in their perspectives. Murray began by criticising the simplistic view that immigration issues are solely about the number of migrants. He emphasised that historical context is crucial. Murray argued that Britain has shown exceptional tolerance towards migrants compared to most countries. He asserted that if other countries had experienced the same levels of immigration as the UK, their responses would be less accepting. Murray believes that the criticism of British attitudes towards immigration is often unfair.
To about 2 months of immigration in the 1990s. 50,000 was about 2 months. The Ugandan Asians expelled by Idi Amin, which this country, I think, rightly took in, numbered 30,000 people. 30,000 people by the late 1990s was 6 weeks of immigration. So my point to you, first of all, is that the speed and the rate matters, and it matters for a reason which I am going to come back to in a moment. But first, let me mention some of the arguments that have come up which do need answering about this. The first is the inevitable argument that the reason why we need mass immigration and have needed it is because there are jobs that British people will not do, and we need to import people to do those jobs. Let me say to you as frankly as it is possible to say, that is one of the most racist arguments you can hear. It suggests that there are jobs which British people not only don't want to do, but shouldn't do, don't have to do. We don't have to even encourage them to do. Please, you've had your go. We don't even need to encourage them to do. But we will go around the rest of the world and hoover up people who are willing to work for nothing because it provides us with cheap nannies and cheap waiters in restaurants and so on. I think it's a lamentable argument. The second argument you can hear, and we had it already tonight, is the argument about the hoovering up, as I would put it, of the other end, as it were, of the economic spectrum, that it is the best idea possible that we will travel around the world and hoover up nurses and doctors in Africa and across other regions of the world, that we can take people from the third world who the third world has superbly educated and make sure they benefit us. Again, I think a lamentable argument. Look, the argument on immigration often comes down to net benefits. Is it an economic net benefit or an economic problem? You can, incidentally, on the material in this, find pretty much a 50-50 divide. About 50% of the studies say that there's a huge impact positively for the country. About the other 50% say the opposite. And by the way, that even goes, Lord Singh, to the study you cited. You cited the UCL study. That same study found that between 1995 and 2011, migrants in the UK received £95 billion more in services and benefits than they contributed in taxes. That's the same study that you cited. Another one that we get told, and we got it from someone on the floor, we need immigrants because they're going to pay our pensions. Ladies and gentlemen, whoever the gentleman is, let me tell you something, a shocking fact. Immigrants get old as well. An amazing fact. Which means that if you have that model, every single year you need to import more and more immigrants because you need to support that. It's known as the pyramid or migration model, and it doesn't work either. Look, one of the strange things about having this debate is this. Everyone thinks that they have to tiptoe. I'm sure you're nervous about walking through the proposition lobby tonight. I'm sure you are, because this is an issue which is fervid and fetid in all sorts of ways. But one of the oddities about this is that there is complete political unanimity on this side of the House. Complete political unanimity. Jack Straw, who was one of the Labour ministers who presided over that catastrophic period of too fast immigration, now says, he said it in November of last year, that it was a spectacular mistake. That's his words, a spectacular mistake. David Miliband, now Labour leader, says that at the next general election... Very easily done. Apologies. Ed Miliband, now Labour leader, says that if he wins the next general election, which he could, he will bring net immigration down because he realizes his party got this wrong. He said in September of last year, I want to get overall immigration down. David Cameron, Nadim's party leader, the man who would be properly Prime Minister, perhaps.
Maya Goodfellow, on the other hand, argued that immigrants are often unfairly blamed for issues like low wages and failing public services. She pointed out that research shows underinvestment in public services is a bigger issue than immigration. Goodfellow also highlighted that anti-immigration sentiments existed even when migration numbers were low, suggesting that these feelings are deeply rooted in British society. The debate shifted to how immigration impacts cultural identity. Goodfellow suggested that prejudice and cultural anxiety are real issues but should be addressed without dismissing people's genuine concerns as mere racism. She called for understanding and breaking down prejudices rather than labelling concerns as bigoted. Murray responded by reinforcing that Britain's history of tolerance is remarkable. He noted that the country's institutions, such as the monarchy and parliament, have been shaped by Protestant Christian values for centuries. While acknowledging the importance of remaining open to others, Murray stressed the need to protect and maintain the core cultural and religious values that have historically defined Britain.
People are fleeing from around the world, but also to the places they're fleeing to the refugee camps, migrant camps that people end up in. And I've been struck by so many thoughts during this time, but one of them is that there are so many utopian dreams that occur. People dream that you could live in a borderless world on one hand. Other people pretend you could just stop anyone coming. These are impossible dreams, but somewhere in the middle of them is something we need to aim for. And one of the ways I've started to realize that we need to think about this is in the following terms, not about right or wrong or, good and bad. I'm a good person, you're a Nazi. It's too easy. What we need to think about with this is that we're in a situation with migration talking about competing virtues. There are two virtues in this whole debate that are in serious competition, not just between people, but within all of us. The first virtue, I would say, is the virtue of mercy, the desire to be merciful to our fellow human beings who are suffering. And we all feel that. Everybody should feel that. But there is also another virtue here, the virtue of justice. And that's not just justice for people fleeing countries, but justice for people in the countries that they are fleeing to. And we can't ignore those two parts. We need to recognize that's what's going on here. This is why it's so difficult, and the debate goes down the middle of all of us. So look, there are so many questions we need to think about if we're going to address this. And I'm so glad, by the way, this isn't a debate, because this is a very not debatable issue. But why we need to think about this. Let me give you just 6 examples of things we need to think about much more deeply than we have. The first is this. I would suggest it is very obvious that the developing world cannot move to the developed world. So what do we do? Who can come? That's one part of that question. And the second part, which is much harder, who can't? We are very, very bad at having even a bit of that debate, but we need to. Secondly, what are the differences between people fleeing for their lives from a war zone and people fleeing serious, severe economic deprivation in, for instance, sub-Saharan Africa? Now, there are differences, but if you recognize that, then you've got to work out where along the way you would put your line for legitimate asylum claims. A third of people in sub-Saharan Africa polled last year by Gallup said they wanted to move and leave sub-Saharan Africa. So you've got to work out along this way, if you're going to have a sustainable asylum policy, who qualifies for it. And I would suggest we're not very good at having that discussion either. A third point. We know that some cultures find it easier to mix into other cultures than others, but we don't know exactly how. And we don't know what the proportions of people are in another culture that work well, integrate well, adapt well, and what the proportions are that start to make that integration, that adaptation far harder. We have thought very little about this, and what thinking there has been pretty bad. Let me give you another example of something we need to think about. How do we deal with a question this serious in the age of social media? An age when a single photograph of a single person can go all around the world, and everybody sees it, and everybody says something must be done. And their politicians think, I've got to do something. And then they do something, and the public say, no, that wasn't the something we were thinking of. We thought of something else, but we don't know what. How do we live in that world? How do politicians act in that world? How do we have any form of political leadership in that world? How do we work out what the right thing to do is in that world? Not just in the short term, but in the long term too. I'll give you a fifth question. How do we ensure that we're able to have a serious and deep debate about these issues, and that we're able to allow people to express legitimate concerns and have that debate without those legitimate concerns being dismissed as xenophobic, nativist, and so on? How do we work out where that might be the case, and how do we work out where it's not, where there are legitimate fears? Sixth question, how do we overcome fatalism? Fatalism you hear everywhere these days, sometimes in the spirit of optimism. This is the world as it is now. People move. This is globalization. Get used to it. Suck it up. Don't complain. How do we get used to that? How do we deal with that? Now,
Murray's critique of Goodfellow's perspective was direct. He argued that British institutions, which have been crucial to the country's stability and identity, are not under threat from migration. He suggested that the impact of migration on attitudes takes time to manifest, and that concerns about rapid changes in society are valid. According to Murray, it's important to address these concerns seriously rather than dismissing them as xenophobia.
Because of climate change, people are already having to move within regions, across countries, to different countries. Their lives are being affected in immeasurable ways all around the world. Even if climate change is addressed in any meaningful way in the next few years, people are going to have to move, and they're going to have to move in significant numbers. I don't think we should be talking about this in scaremongering terms, using the language of floods or threat or mass migration. What we need to do is recognise people are going to have to move and respond to that in a compassionate and humane way. That means changing the immigration debate and changing policy in the UK, and it also means talking about the fact that people who will have to move because of climate change are not covered by existing convention like the 1951 Refugee Convention, so trying to find ways to ensure that people are protected if they have to move, and making sure that we fundamentally change the debate in the UK so they are not talked about as a threat to this country.
Goodfellow's argument was that anti-immigration sentiment often stems from broader anxieties about societal change rather than outright racism. She believed that historical context shows a pattern of hostility towards migrants which needs to be understood and addressed. Murray countered by pointing out that the UK's long history of accepting and integrating migrants shows a level of tolerance that is rare globally. He highlighted that rapid demographic changes can lead to cultural shifts which may challenge societal norms and values. Murray emphasised that while the UK should continue to be welcoming, it must also safeguard its cultural identity.
Welcome everyone to the first seminar in the Development Studies seminar series. We're very pleased to have Maya Goodfellow joining us. She's going to be talking about debunking the myths about immigration. And Maya, this follows on from her book that's just come out with Verso called The Hostile Environment. And she's a writer, an academic, a broadcast commentator. She's written for the New York Times, The Guardian, The New Statesman, and on a range of issues, including UK politics, gender, race, and immigration. She has a PhD in the department, and she's, as I say, author of Hostile Environment, How Immigrants Became Scapegoats, and that's out with Verso. It's just come out, actually. So she's going to speak for about 45 minutes, and then we'll hear from Paru with a few comments, and then there might be a little bit of a Q&A, and then we'll open it out to the floor. Thanks.
Thank you, Faizi, for that. Thank you also to everyone who's involved in putting on this series of events. I know they're really well attended, and I'm really pleased to be able to take part in one of them. Thank you, everyone, for coming as well on what is a pretty grim Tuesday evening. So what I'm going to do is So the book that Faizi mentioned, it kind of charts the history of immigration policy and rhetoric in the UK specifically, and looks at some of the main arguments that are made against immigration. And instead of going through that history, what I'm going to do is maybe spend the next half an hour to 40 minutes talking about how the debate has historically manifested, and this kind of maps on to a lot of the contemporary discourses we see today. I'll try and mention some of those as well. So I want to challenge essentially the two main arguments that are made against immigration. One which falls into the camp of economics, and the other which falls into the camp of culture. But before I want to do that, I want to speak about a particular case, which I think illuminates some of the things that I'm going to talk about. And this is the case of Joy Gardner. So I just want to get this is not a test. I'm not trying to shame anyone. I just want to get a sense. I've done this a few times, and it's always interesting to get a sense in the room of how many of you know who Joy Gardner is, or the case of Joy Gardner. If you could raise your hand. Okay, so there's maybe a few people. Okay. Yeah, I'm not going to say comment on that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk a bit about Joy Gardner's case. For those of you who know, this will be a recap, and for those of you who don't, this will be an introduction into what happened to Joy Gardner. And I'll try to explain why I'm doing this as I go. So Joy Gardner was born in Jamaica, and she grew up in Long Bay, Portland. She came to the UK in 1987 when she was 34 years old, and she came to join her mother, who had come to the UK from Jamaica.
Research supports that concerns about immigration often relate to rapid changes and their effects on community identity and stability rather than the number of immigrants. Studies show that people are more anxious about the pace of change and its impact on public services and jobs than about xenophobia itself. Murray also highlighted historical migration patterns, comparing them to today's diverse and large-scale movements. He argued that past migrations like the Norman Conquest involved relatively small and culturally similar groups, whereas contemporary migrations are more diverse.
Articulated is the idea that immigration is a threat to
British culture and to British people's way of life. So this thinking comes from a belief that anti-immigration feeling, so when people in Britain say they dislike immigration, that dislike has come from a natural reaction to too many immigrants of a certain kind coming into the country. Right? So people dislike immigration because there are too many immigrants here, basically. That's the argument that is made by people that I would call anti-immigration professionals. That I won't name them. So a really good example of this is when David Cameron and his team were trying to negotiate with Brussels before the EU referendum. They said they couldn't find any evidence that would satisfy the European Commission that immigration put pressure on communities. Right? So they said we couldn't find any evidence at all. And then this is a quote from someone who worked with David Cameron. He said, "There was no hard evidence. That is not to say that we didn't perceive immigration as a problem. Cameron was convinced it was a real challenge, if perhaps more of a cultural one than an economic one." And so there is this acceptance right at the heart of government that immigration is not bad for the economy. They cannot prove that. They cannot prove that as part of these EU negotiations. They think it is a cultural problem. And you hear that culture argument in a lot of different ways. It's talked about in a lot of different ways. So people talk about the pace of change being too fast, and people talk about that they feel like their sense of British culture is under threat. People talk about walking down their local high street and not recognising where they are and feeling like they're in a different country and they're no longer in Britain. But all of this is produced by notions of racial and cultural difference. And the adage that's been used a lot by politicians in the past 15, 20 years is that it's not racist to be concerned about immigration. But what that does is it eclipses, it obscures how race can be at the heart of the debate. And so much of our debate is so focused on saying it's not racist to be concerned about immigration that it becomes very difficult to take a moment to analyse how race is operating in the debate and where. And one of the things that I found doing some of the research for the book is I watched quite a lot of documentaries about immigration in Britain, trying to see how it was covered in the media. It's a really hard thing to do, to try and track how broadcast media covers issues like immigration. So there's only a partial picture. But what I found in 3 different documentaries across 3 different channels was that when the journalists who were doing these documentaries, they chose particular areas to go to. They chose particular areas of the country to go and look at. And they decided to look at those particular areas. The way they made that decision is that they looked at an area and looked at how many white people had lived in that area 20 years ago and how many white people live in that area now. Right? So whiteness was used as a marker of change. And what they were saying is the proportion of white people living in X town was 95% in the 1980s, and now it is only 70%. And so what that tells us, and they're not aware they're doing this, I don't think, is it shows one of the ways in which the immigration debate is very much still about racism, because not all groups of immigrants, some immigrants are white.
The debate also touched on polling data, which shows that increasing immigration can correlate with decreasing tolerance on certain social issues. Murray used examples such as attitudes toward homosexuality to illustrate how new arrivals' views can impact the overall societal outlook. David Coleman from Oxford University supports Murray's concerns, noting that without effective integration strategies, rapid demographic changes can leave parts of society feeling alienated, hindering the development of a shared national identity. The discussion concluded with a call to consider how cultural shifts affect British society and its core values. Viewers were encouraged to share their thoughts in the comments and to stay updated with ongoing discussions about these important issues. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and for more content like this, be sure to subscribe to the channel.